In the quiet stillness of a museum vault, behind thick glass and forgotten shelves, rests an ancient iron axe head. It was born from fire over 800 years ago, in the year 1200. Its surface wears a dark patina, like aged stone kissed by centuries. But lift it, and you feel the strength still humming inside. The edge remains intact, no pitting, no fractures. The iron is whole, silent, patient. Now walk into your own backyard. Open the shed. You'll find a modern axe, maybe 2 years old. Already the blade is scarred with orange rust. In just a few more seasons, it will be useless, discarded, broken, gone. This tool, crafted in high-tech factories with robotic precision, cannot last even a fraction of what that ancient one has endured. How can this be? How could something shaped with primitive hammers in a clay furnace outlive our finest engineered steel by centuries? The answer is not magic, but it feels like magic. It's chemistry, forgotten, misunderstood, and buried beneath the noise of modern convenience. We didn't lose this knowledge in war or disaster. We gave it away. We traded it, slowly, deliberately, for speed, for mass production, for shelves full of tools that fail in 5 years. But once, long ago, there were men who shaped iron like monks copying scripture, slowly, reverently, and with a deep intuitive understanding of something we no longer see. And if you've ever felt that the tools of today lack a soul, if you've ever picked up something modern and felt it was built to be thrown away, then you're not wrong. There's something ancient calling beneath the rust, a quiet truth hidden in slag and smoke and hammer blows. And tonight, we're going to uncover it. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what we now have. Today, when you hold a tool in your hand, an axe, a shovel, a spade, you are holding what modern metallurgists call mild steel. It's uniform, predictable, designed for efficiency, not for endurance. This steel contains about 0.25% carbon, no slag, no phosphorus. All the old imperfections have been erased. We call this progress. But in the past, the blacksmith's iron was different. It wasn't sterile. It was alive with trace memories. Carbon just a whisper at 0.05%, but slag as high as 2%, like threads of forgotten glass woven through the metal. There was phosphorus too, drawn naturally from the earth, like the breath of the stone it came from. And then we removed it all. The factories stripped these elements away, not because they were harmful, but because they were inconvenient. Slag made steel stubborn during rolling. Phosphorus made it unpredictable under welders' flames. So we purified, streamlined, mass-produced. But here's what we didn't realize until too late. Those impurities were never flaws. They were guardians. Modern rust is relentless. A single drop of moisture touches steel. The oxygen reacts with iron and rust blooms, but it doesn't stop at the surface. This rust is porous. It holds the moisture in. It invites more. Corrosion tunnels deep, following the invisible pathways between the grains of steel like roots pushing through cracked stone. One tiny flaw becomes a fracture. One moment of rain becomes the beginning of the end, and there is nothing to stop it. But in the old world, in the age of fire and forge, iron had a silent defense. Slag stringers, invisible to the eye but under the microscope. They looked like veins of crystal running through the metal. Like wood grain, delicate, interwoven, alive. When rust began its assault, it would strike the iron and meet a wall. The slag, the glass, a fracture that didn't open but deflected. The corrosion was blunted, forced to spread sideways, slowed like a river hitting stone. And over time, instead of collapsing, the iron would form a skin, a dark, calm patina, protective, dignified, like the wrinkles of a face that has lived well. This was no accident. It was chemistry without textbooks, wisdom without words, a kind of alchemy born from patience, observation, and devotion. Modern tools don't remember this language, but the ancient ones do. The old smiths didn't know the word phosphorus. They couldn't speak of its atomic weight or its role in oxide formation. They had no periodic table. Only experience, only instinct, only memory passed from calloused hand to calloused hand. But they knew, deep in their bones, what the earth was trying to tell them. In the marshy lowlands of Europe, where the soil bled iron into the wetlands, the blacksmiths found something special: bogs that whispered to those who listened. The iron there was soft, dark, and easily gathered, raked from the ground like fallen leaves. And when they smelted it, something unusual happened. It lasted. It didn't crumble. It didn't rot away. It held itself against the storms and seasons. They didn't know why, but now we do. That iron ore, born of marsh and time, held within it a quiet miracle: phosphorus. When that phosphorus remained in the iron, it became something more than metal. When it met air and water and decades of wear, it performed a sacred transformation. A thin skin formed, dense, crystalline, invisible to the eye but impenetrable to time. It sealed the iron from oxygen. It stopped the rust before it could begin. A blessing wrapped in corrosion. It was nature speaking in chemistry, and the smiths, though untrained in science, listened with reverence. They didn't refine the phosphorus out. They didn't strip the soul from the ore. They left it intact because it worked, and that was enough. But this quiet miracle wasn't only found in Europe. Across the world, the earth gave its secrets to those who paid attention. In Delhi, India, there stands a silent giant, the Iron Pillar. Over 1,600 years old, 6 tons of pure iron, and almost no rust. For generations, it was a mystery, a monument immune to decay. Scientists puzzled, tourists stared. How could it be? The answer was there all along, etched in the iron's quiet memory. It too held phosphorus. It too carried the invisible skin. Over time, it formed a layer of iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, a barrier so stable, so resistant, that even monsoon rains could not break it. Not magic, but something that feels like magic. Across continents, smiths in different lands discovered the same truth without speaking a word to each other. Not because they shared formulas, but because they shared faith in what the ore revealed. The iron itself was different in those places, and they let it speak. In Toledo, Spain, the mountains gave iron with trace amounts of nickel and chromium, elements we now add to make stainless steel. But back then, it was the mountain's gift. The swords made there resisted decay better than others. Not because the smiths were more skilled, but because the earth had whispered differently in that place. And in India's south, the legendary Woot steel, Damascus steel to the Western world, held mysteries no modern lab had seen before. Carbon nanotubes, structures so intricate, so advanced, they were not rediscovered until the 1990s. The smiths didn't know what they were forging, but they knew how, and that was enough. These blades, carried along ancient trade routes from Indian furnaces to Arabian forges, were not just tools. They were sacred expressions of patience, of listening, of honoring the materials as they came. Because true mastery is not the power to change everything. It is the wisdom to change nothing when the earth already knows best. It was not a factory. It was not a machine. It was a chimney of clay and stone, standing no taller than a man, breathing smoke into the sky. And yet, this was where the soul of iron was born. They called it a bloomer, a simple vessel. But within it, a transformation took place. Slow, imperfect, and utterly sacred. Charcoal, ore, fire, layer upon layer, carefully arranged. Then the bellows began, pulsing life into the coals. The furnace did not roar. It whispered. It breathed. Its heat rose not in rage, but in patience. 1,200 degrees Celsius, enough to unlock iron's spirit, but not enough to melt it. That was the secret. Modern furnaces burn hotter, faster, melting iron into obedient liquid. But the bloomer stayed just below that threshold. The ore was not destroyed. It was released. The fire whispered to the metal, not shouted. The carbon monoxide from the charcoal pulled oxygen away from the ore, like breath drawn from stone. And in that breathless state, tiny grains of pure iron were born. They rained down into the furnace, falling through molten slag like stars drifting through a glowing sky. These grains clumped together, forming a bloom a glowing, spongy mass that looked less like a tool and more like something volcanic. Alive, unshaped, waiting, when the furnace was cracked open and that bloom dragged into the night air, the smith stood before it not as a laborer, but as a kind of midwife. Now the real work began. Hours of reheating, hammering, listening to the ring of the metal, like monks listening to bells. Again and again the smith struck, not to shape the metal alone, but to awaken it, to stretch the slag into lines, to push the carbon deeper, to weld particles into unity. Some parts stayed soft, wrought iron, gentle and flexible. Some became harder, steel, fierce and sharp. All of it interwoven, all of it alive with memory. There were no shortcuts. Every strike mattered. Every hour added layers of strength not visible to the eye, but known to the hand. What emerged was not just a tool, but a covenant, a promise between maker and metal. Today, steel is pressed through cold rollers in seconds, efficient, identical, disposable. But then, it took 3 days to birth an axe head. 3 days of flame, breath, and rhythm. Because permanence is not found in speed, it is found in devotion. To understand why the old iron resisted time, you must understand what it meant. A tool in those days was not a purchase. It was a sacrifice. To own an axe was to hold the labor of a master in your hands, 3 days of heat, hammer, and human will. The cost? A month's wages, sometimes more. A sword? 6 months. Half a year of life traded for a single blade. These weren't objects, they were investments, and they were expected to last, not for years, but for generations. So people cared for them. They oiled them like sacred relics. They stored them high, dry, and wrapped in cloth. They knew these tools would outlive them, and so they named them, marked them, wrote them into their wills. A man might die with little else, but his hammer, that was legacy. A plow that failed at the start of planting could mean hunger. A blade that shattered in battle could mean death. So blacksmiths did not guess. They trained 7 years to become an apprentice, 7 more to be called a master, and only then were they trusted to sell their work. But even that trust could be taken. If your blade broke too soon, if your tool failed too fast, you were cast out of the guild. No guild, no work, no name, no trade. The guild's honor came before the smith's pride, because every broken tool was a stain, not just on the maker, but on the sacred pact between the craft and the people. This pressure, this brutal accountability, created something that could not rust, not because it was magic, but because failure meant exile, because quality was the only path to survival. Now go to a hardware store, pick up an axe for $15. It will rust in 2 years, and when it does, you'll throw it away. No one will be punished. No guild will fall. No honor will be lost. You will simply buy another, not because it's better, but because it's easier. This is not a conspiracy. This is not corruption. It is just profitable to make things weak, to make them cheap, to make you need them again. We call it planned obsolescence. But the truth is simpler. It is not that we forgot how to make tools that last. It is that we stopped valuing permanence at all. Even after the last hammer fell, the work was not done. The ancient blacksmith standing over the finished blade knew this truth. Fresh iron is like a newborn, strong but vulnerable. It must be protected, anointed, blessed. And so they performed a ritual, not superstition, but sacred habit. They called it nothing. We might call it seasoning. The blade, fresh from its final shaping, would be gently heated just until it glowed a soft, dull red. Not bright, not fierce, just warm enough to open its pores. Then came the oil, sometimes linseed, sometimes animal fat, rubbed into the surface with care while the iron was still breathing heat. In that moment, something beautiful happened. The oil did not sit on top like paint. It became part of the iron, polymerizing, sealing, bonding. It formed a molecular skin, thin, invisible, yet stronger than rust. It was the same method we use today to season a cast iron pan, a forgotten echo of a much older wisdom. But today's tools, they come cold. Perhaps a whisper of machine oil wiped away by the first drop of rain. No one tells you to season your shovel. No one teaches you to anoint your blade, because the tools are not made to be kept. They are made to be replaced. But in the past, iron was alive. And when used often, when touched by hands, warmed by work, exposed to air and friction, it formed something rare, a dark protective patina, not the orange of rot, but the black of strength. Magnetite, a stable iron oxide, dense and shield-like. Human oils, the motion of labor, the dryness of proper storage, these things nourished the patina, maintained it, strengthened it. Iron, like the people who wielded it, grew tougher with use. It matured, it remembered, and so a tool that was passed from grandfather to grandson came not just with function, but with a history written into its very surface. We abandoned these practices not because they failed, but because they required care, time, intention. Modern steel needs none of that, because it is not meant to endure. You might ask, if the old way was so powerful, why don't we return to it? And the answer is simple. A bloomer furnace yields 50 pounds of iron in a day. A modern blast furnace yields thousands of tons. We gained scale. We lost control. In the modern method, the iron melts completely. The slag is skimmed off as waste. The carbon is refined with precision. The steel emerges clean, fast, and soulless. But you cannot create slag stringers in liquid metal. You cannot preserve phosphorus when you're chasing purity. You cannot form a sacred bond with something made to vanish. The old process was not slow because they were ignorant. It was slow because that was the only way for iron to remember itself. We gave up that memory. We called it progress. But every rusted tool, every fence post turned to dust, is a quiet confession. We once knew better. When the bloom was pulled from the fire, it was not pure, it was chaos. Soft iron, hard steel, veins of slag, uneven carbon, fragments of difference, tangled together like a forgotten cord. A lesser smith would see this as a flaw, but a master, he saw it as a gift. Because he did not demand perfection from his metal, he listened. He learned what each piece wanted to become. He would take a sliver from the bloom, strike it against the grinding wheel, and watch the sparks fly. The language of light spoke plainly. Soft iron danced in long, lazy orange trails. High carbon steel burst into white starbursts. This was his code. This was his map. From it, he began to compose. The hard steel, precious, sharp, unyielding, would become the edge. The soft iron, tough, forgiving, would form the body and spine. And then, the union. The smith would lay the metals together, heat them to white glow, and strike. Not as a blacksmith, but as a priest performing a sacred binding. The surfaces began to liquefy, not melt, just enough to let the atoms reach for each other. And with each hammer blow, the metals became one. Not blended, not confused, but joined. A marriage of opposites. A blade was born, its edge holding sharpness like frozen lightning, its body absorbing shock like a tree in the wind. Not a single material trying to be both, but two materials, each doing what it did best. Some smiths took it further. They twisted bars of iron and steel together before forging a dance of metals frozen in motion. Pattern-welded blades, their surfaces shimmered like water, ripples of light, waves of structure. But this wasn't just beauty. It was armor. Each weld line became a barrier. Each interface a chance for slag to settle into protective patterns. Every ripple was a wall against rust. Every swirl was a memory of resistance. These blades were not just strong. They were wise, layered like time, alive with purpose. We look at these ancient tools and marvel at their survival. But the truth is simple. They endured not because the smiths imposed their will on the metal, but because they allowed the metal to become what it truly was meant to be. There are objects in this world that have outlived the men who made them, outlived the cities they were forged to defend, outlived the languages spoken when their edge first met wood or flesh or stone. Iron that was born of fire, and then stayed. There is a blade now resting in a museum in northern Germany that once belonged to a knight who died at the Battle of Visby in 1361. His name is lost, but his sword remains, still sharp, still whole. Its hilt is corroded, yes, but the blade itself gleams beneath a thin veil of darkened patina. He fell in the dust. The sword did not. How? It was not protected, not sealed in a vault, not displayed in a dry, modern exhibit case. It lay beneath the earth for over 6 centuries, buried in the salt-damp soil of Gotland. And yet, the iron endured. Why? Because that blade was forged in a time when metallurgy still listened to the voice of the ore, when the slag was left in, not taken out, when the sword was born not just of heat, but of care. This is not a lone miracle. In the ruined walls of a 12th century monastery in Wales, archaeologists found a rusted hinge, still attached to the fallen door. The wood had long since rotted. The stones had cracked and shifted, but the hinge, iron, impure, forgotten, still held its curve, still turned when touched. How do you explain that? It was not paint, not coating, not stainless steel. It was metallurgy rooted in accident and ritual, slag stringers, phosphorus-rich iron, forged slow, forged hot, left imperfect and therefore eternal. Off the coast of Finland, divers recovered something strange. A sword buried in the seabed. Its grip was gone, its scabbard rotted away, but the blade? Still sharp, still solid. It had slept beneath the waves for over 700 years. Salt water should have devoured it. Modern steel left in that same place would have corroded into nothing in less than 20. But this blade had been folded, tempered, made from bog iron drawn from a riverbank with high phosphorus content and threads of glass slag through its spine. Not by design, but by instinct. And that instinct saved it. Science now knows what the smith never could have explained. That phosphorus-rich oxides formed over time can halt corrosion at a molecular level. That slag fiber disrupts the vertical tunneling of rust. That the very imperfections of the material become its salvation. But to the smith, it was just good iron, the kind that spoke clearly under the hammer. In a farmhouse outside Lyon, France, a wooden box was found in the hayloft. Inside, tools, a spade, a chisel, and a blacksmith's hammer. The tools belonged to a man named Emile, who worked the land in the 1800s. His family had held on to them, not because they were rare, but because they still worked. 200 years. And the hammer face, though worn smooth, had no rust beyond a surface blush. How? Because Emile had seasoned it after every winter, oiled it with goose fat, stored it in cloth, used it weekly. Modern science might call it maintenance, but for him it was respect. And so the iron remembered and stayed. In a small village in Sweden, an axe has been passed down through 9 generations. It was first forged in 1723. The family keeps a logbook, written on yellowing paper, of every owner, every repair, every handle replaced. Every year it chopped the first firewood of winter. The blade has never needed replacement. Its edge is dark now, thick with patina. The initials of the first owner are barely visible, but it still splits logs cleanly, still rings true when it bites. It's not a relic. It's still in use. How many factory-made axes survive even 1 decade of real labor? This one has survived the rise and fall of empires, because it was made not just to cut, but to last. Imagine what these tools have seen. The sword buried at Visby witnessed blood and silence. The hinge in Wales heard prayers echo and fade. The sea-bound blade slept through storms and tides. The hammer in Lyon shaped wood that built cradles and coffins. The Swedish axe warmed homes through plagues and wars and cold decades. And yet, they remain. They are not just iron. They are witnesses, not because they were made in laboratories, but because they were born of a deeper trust, a belief that when you work with the materials of the earth, you owe them more than speed. You owe them patience. You owe them respect. Today, we use scanning electron microscopes to study these blades. We cut samples. We measure oxide layers. We test corrosion pathways. We call it research. But what we discover only confirms what was already known. That slag, once dismissed as impurity, forms capillaries that absorb moisture and hold it away from core structures. That phosphorus, once removed as a contaminant, creates stable, dense oxides that act as ceramic shields. That repeated hot working, though time-consuming, aligns these elements into microstructures modern metallurgy struggles to replicate. The stillness of these ancient blades is not superstition. It is physics forged slow. And above all, It is the result of a human being spending time with the metal, listening, watching the colors, hearing the ring, trusting the memory in the ore. So next time you walk into a store and buy a tool, hold it in your hand and ask, will this still be here after I'm gone? Will this still work for my children? Will it be remembered? Most modern tools are not meant to be. But the old ones, buried, rusted, weathered, and scarred, they chose to remain because someone, long ago, chose to make them worthy of staying. That is the true genius of ancient iron. It did not shout. It did not gleam. It simply waited and watched as kingdoms rose and fell and were forgotten, while the iron remained. Long before the microscope, before metallurgy, before carbon content was measured in decimals, there was only fire, stone, and the sound of the hammer. And into that silence, something strange was born. Iron, but to the ancient mind, it wasn't just a metal. It was something alive, something fallen from the heavens, something that bled red when struck, that grew stronger through pain, that remembered heat. They did not call it Fe or speak of molecular structures. They called it by older names, names woven with awe, names wrapped in reverence, because to them iron was not just from the earth. It was from somewhere else. In Egypt, before the pharaohs ruled with golden masks, there were already iron beads being worn around the necks of the dead. But this iron didn't come from the ground. It came from the sky. Meteoric iron, cosmic in origin, rich in nickel, was gathered from the desert sands after fireballs blazed across the night. The Egyptians shaped it, slowly, reverently, into ornaments and blades. They had no furnaces hot enough to smelt terrestrial iron yet. So where did this metal come from, they wondered? The heavens. And so they called it iron from the sky. They believed it was the bones of the gods, that it carried messages from the stars. Later, when the ability to smelt iron from the earth emerged, the reverence remained. Because whether fallen or forged, iron always felt like something more. In Norse mythology, the blacksmith was a sacred figure, equal parts craftsman, sorcerer, and priest. The god Völundr, the Wayland smith, was not merely skilled. He was feared. His forge was not a workshop. It was a place of transformation, where metal bled and sang, where vengeance was shaped. The Norse believed that iron was bound to the spirit of the land, that it could cut not just flesh but fate. Before battle, swords were sometimes buried for days in sacred soil, to feed on the earth's strength. In other cases, blades were woken by being touched to fire, moonlight, or blood. Some were named and spoken to like beasts. There was belief that a blade could become cursed if mistreated, or blessed if it took a righteous kill. The blacksmith's forge was where destiny was bent, and iron was the vessel. In the Middle East, ancient Jewish and Islamic traditions both held strange relationships with iron. In some cases, iron was forbidden in sacred spaces. The temple in Jerusalem, according to Talmudic sources, was built without the sound of iron tools. No iron could be used on the stones of the altar. Why? Because iron makes weapons, and weapons spill blood, and blood defiles the sacred. Even today, observant Jewish communities avoid iron knives on the Sabbath dinner table, a memory of older laws and older fears. Islamic texts also speak of iron as gifted, a material sent down by God. In the Quran, Surah Al-Hadid, iron is described as having great military might and benefits for humanity. But it must be used responsibly, for protection, not cruelty. Iron was both a tool and a test, not to be worshipped, but never to be taken lightly. In parts of West Africa, iron was not merely useful, it was spiritual currency. Among the Dogon, Yoruba, and Bantu peoples, blacksmiths were revered, often holding social ranks higher than chiefs. Why? Because they shaped the one material that no one else could. Iron was linked to birth, death, and the ancestors. New tools were fed with sacrificial blood before use. Blades were passed over newborns for protection. Sick children were rubbed with cold iron to absorb illness. In ritual ceremonies, iron objects were planted in the ground to call rain, stop drought, or guard the village against witchcraft. The forge itself was sacred. It mimicked the womb. It held the power to create life or take it. To be a blacksmith in those societies was to walk a narrow, powerful path, equal parts fear and honor. In Japan, the process of making a katana was not just a craft. It was a ritual. Swordsmiths would purify themselves before working, fasting, praying, bathing. They dressed in white. The forge was cleaned. The bellows were operated to the rhythm of chants. Why such discipline? Because in Shinto belief, purity was essential. Impurity brought chaos. And a blade, once forged, could carry the spirit of its maker. If the smith was angry, the blade would carry anger. If the smith was calm, the blade would bring peace. Swords were not just weapons. They were kami, spiritual beings, guardians, extensions of the soul. Some were never used in battle at all. They were placed in temples, wrapped in silk, left as offerings to the gods. In European folklore, iron repelled evil, witches, fairies, spirits. They could not cross iron. People nailed horseshoes above doors, hung iron scissors by windows, placed knives under their pillows, not for protection from men, but from nightmares. It was not the sharpness that mattered. It was the ironness. Even today, echoes of this belief remain. We say touch iron to avoid bad luck. We believe old railroads or iron fences hold strange energy. We're not far removed from the days when every child wore a charm of rusted metal against the evil eye. Science scoffs, but the stories endure, because at some deep level, we remember. Here's the quiet truth. No matter where you look, Africa, Asia, Scandinavia, the Pacific Islands, iron arrived like a miracle, because it changed everything. Stone could break, bone could splinter, bronze could bend, but iron could hold. It could cut deeper, plow faster, defend longer, and most of all, it required fire. To make iron, you had to tame flame, not just burn it, control it, and that was divine. It turned man into creator, into sorcerer, into something dangerously close to a god. So the reverence was natural, because iron was not found in nature, ready to use. It had to be coaxed, summoned, birthed, and anything that powerful had to be respected. Even now, we still carry this instinct. We don't hang horseshoes for function. We don't pass down old tools just for efficiency. We do it because we feel something. An old hammer, an ancient sword, a rusted blade in a museum case. They carry stories, not just of use, but of meaning. They whisper of gods, of rights, of sacrifice. And when you hold a piece of old iron, you're not just holding metal. You're holding myth, a myth forged in flame and cooled in memory. They never studied engineering. They didn't write formulas. They didn't know what carbon was. Yet their blades could cut stone. Their axes could outlast war. Their iron could sleep in soil for centuries and still rise whole. How? Not by luck, not by magic, but by science they couldn't name. Theirs was a knowledge not written in books, but in color, in sound, in touch, in the rhythm of flame and the echo of steel. They didn't define chemistry. They practiced it, one hammer blow at a time. When you quench a red-hot blade in pure water, something deceptive happens. The metal should cool instantly, but it doesn't, because the moment the glowing steel touches the liquid, a layer of steam forms around it, a ghostly barrier that insulates the metal and slows the cooling. This is called the Leidenfrost effect. The blade is boiling the water away before it can reach the surface, and so the steel cools too slowly. It hardens less. The blacksmiths didn't know the term Leidenfrost, but they knew the problem, and they solved it with salt or with urine. Strange, yes, but effective. Urine contains salts, sodium, potassium, chlorides that break up the steam barrier. When the blade entered the quench, these mineral particulates punched through the vapor. The liquid touched the steel. The cooling accelerated. The result? A harder blade. Science would call it nucleate boiling. They just called it what works. To the modern eye, a blade is done once it's sharp. But to the medieval smith, the sharpness came later. First came the temper. Once the blade was hardened through quenching, it was still too brittle. Like glass, sharp but fragile. So they brought it back to the fire, gently, carefully, and watched as the colors bloomed. Pale straw yellow, golden bronze, peacock blue, deep violet. Each color meant a different temperature, and each temperature reshaped the metal's internal lattice in a different way. At 230 degrees, the steel became hard, perfect for chisels. At 280 degrees, it became more flexible, ideal for swords. At 320 degrees, it could absorb impact, like a spring. But there were no thermometers, only eyes. The smith would polish the blade, watch the hues run like spirits through the steel, and at just the right moment, quench, lock it in, forever. Today, we call this oxidation layer tempering. We measure it in labs, but the smiths learned it by watching, by failing, by listening, until the colors spoke to them like old friends. Under a microscope, modern steel looks uniform, but old iron? Old iron looks like wood. Grain, flow, striation, tiny fibers, slag stringers woven through the body of the metal. They shouldn't be there. Slag is waste, glass left over from smelting. But in the bloomery process, not all of it could be removed. And in the act of hammering, those microscopic threads stretched through the iron like veins. Modern metallurgy now understands what they didn't. These slag stringers block corrosion. When rust begins to dig, it hits a thread of slag, and instead of going deeper, it spreads sideways. The metal resists not by fighting, but by redirecting. A defensive labyrinth. Invisible, but sacred. We now simulate this in advanced alloys. But the old smiths, they just let the slag stay. Not because they knew the science, but because the result told them it was right. Modern steel is stripped of phosphorus. It makes welding harder. It lowers ductility. It complicates production. So we remove it. But ancient iron often had it, especially in bog iron from marshlands. The smiths didn't understand why that ore was better, but they knew it was. Today, we know why. When iron rich in phosphorus oxidizes, it forms a specific compound, iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, a crystalline layer, dense, hard, non-porous. It acts like a ceramic shield, sealing the metal from air and water. This is why the 1,600-year-old iron pillar of Delhi hasn't rusted. Not paint, not blessing, just chemistry that no one named, but someone trusted. Steel is iron that contains carbon. Too little and it's soft. Too much and it's brittle. Modern manufacturers measure carbon in percentages. Precise, controlled. But the bloomery, it was chaos. Carbon entered the iron during smelting, drawn in from the charcoal. Unevenly, unpredictably, and yet the smiths learned to see it. They would strike a sample on a grindstone. The sparks would fly. Lazy orange tails meant low carbon, good for hammers and nails. Bright white bursts meant high carbon, perfect for edges. They didn't analyze the chemical bonds. They watched the light and listened to the fire. In time, they could separate a bloom into three parts: wrought iron, steel, cast iron, and forge them together, each where it belonged, because perfection was not found in purity. It was found in harmony. We often imagine ancient blades being folded hundreds of times, layer upon layer. That's not quite true, and it's not always necessary. But where folding did happen, it wasn't just for show. It redistributed carbon. It broke up slag. It created internal consistency. Today, metallurgists call this homogenization. To the smiths, it was just folding until it felt right. Each pass made the blade more stable. Each weld knit the metal tighter. The result wasn't uniformity. It was balance, and balance is what survives. All these techniques, quenching, tempering, grain alignment, carbon control, are taught in modern metallurgy schools. They have equations, graphs, laboratory tests, but the old smiths, they had something else. They had fire, and time, and failure. They burned their hands, ruined their first dozen blades, sat for hours in the glow of the forge, waiting for the color to bloom just so. And slowly, they learned not just how iron behaves, but how it wants to behave. They became fluent in a language the metal never spoke aloud, and every tool they made was a conversation. So much of what we call science today was once called sorcery, but that's only because we hadn't learned how to explain it yet. The blacksmiths didn't cast spells. They watched. They didn't recite formulas. They remembered, and though their names are forgotten, their work still speaks. A knife from 1300 still cuts, not despite its flaws, but because of them, not because of modern technique, but because of ancient truth. And the next time you see an old tool or walk past a blade in a museum case, listen. There is knowledge inside it. Real, silent, scientific, the kind of science that only needs a fire, a hammer, and a man willing to learn from both. The rooster crows, but the blacksmith is already awake, not because he must, but because the iron waits. His hands are thick with old scars, burns he no longer feels, calluses that have forgotten what softness is. His clothes smell of ash and oil. The forge, even when sleeping, lives in his skin. This is not the life of a knight, not the life of a merchant, not a poet or a priest. This is the life of a man who builds what all those others depend on, with nothing but fire and will. Today, like every day, begins with breath and flame. The blacksmith steps into his workshop before the sun touches the roof. It is dark, cool, quiet. There's a sacred stillness here, not because it's holy, but because it's earned. He kneels by the hearth, scoops old charcoal into a mound, stacks it like bones, layers in softwood, shields it from wind. Then, with flint and steel, he breathes life into it. 1 spark, 2, 3, soon a glow, a tiny ember curled like a child. He cups it with his body, protects it, feeds it. The fire does not roar. It grows, like memory, like pain, like purpose. It is not just heat. It is his companion, his confessor. Every smith knows, you do not fight the fire. You join it. As the forge grows warm, the blacksmith checks his tools. Not many. A hammer balanced like a dancer, tongs of different mouths, some for flat stock, others for curved. A chisel, a punch, a rasp. These are not perfect. They are not beautiful, but they are his, made by his own hands, repaired again and again. Each one tells a story. That hammer, the handle is new, shaped from ashwood, but the head, that has struck iron since the plague year, and it still rings true. There's a crack in the village plowshare. The farmer left it by the door last night. Didn't knock, didn't ask, didn't need to. The blacksmith saw it. He knows what it means. If the plow isn't fixed, the field won't turn. If the field doesn't turn, the family won't eat. There's no invoice, no order form. Just trust. The blacksmith places the broken plow into the coals, waits, listens for the color. Steel, when ready, turns a dull cherry red. Not orange, not yellow. Cherry. Too hot and the metal burns. Too cold and it cracks again. He doesn't use a thermometer. He watches the way it glows, like a wound beginning to close. He places it on the anvil and strikes. The sound of the forge isn't noise. It's music. Clang, pause, not frantic, measured. The hammer doesn't just hit the metal. It sings to it. It tells it where to flow, what shape to become. This isn't violence. It's negotiation. The anvil answers. The fire hums. And the smith, he moves like a man dancing with something ancient. With each blow, the crack in the plow vanishes, not by magic, by rhythm, by repetition, by listening. By midday, the blacksmith is soaked in sweat. His apron is stiff with soot. His eyes sting from smoke, but he doesn't stop. He drinks from a clay cup. Water, sometimes beer, just enough to quiet the shaking in his arms. Lunch is bread and fat, maybe an onion. He eats quickly, sitting on a stump outside the shop. The village children pass. They whisper. They've seen the red of the forge, heard the roar of the bellows. To them, the blacksmith is a little frightening, a little magical. They're not wrong. He is the only man in the village who commands flame, who speaks to iron, who builds tools and weapons and secrets. He doesn't mind their fear. He earned it. Later that day, he begins work on something else. A knife for the midwife, a bell for the chapel, a horseshoe for the traveler. Each task carries weight. Each one matters. The blade may cut a cord at birth. The bell may mark a death. The horseshoe may save a journey. Every item he makes becomes part of someone else's story. He does not need praise. He only needs the metal to listen. And when it does, there is peace. Apprentice at the anvil. By his side, a boy works, 12 winters old, thin, quiet. Learning, the apprentice does not strike yet. He watches, fetches coal, pumps the bellows, wipes sweat from the master's brow. He studies every move. This is not school. This is trial. 7 years, maybe more. before the boy can make a nail without shame. But already the fire has touched him. In time his back will bend, his hands will harden, and one day he will take the hammer and begin his own rhythm. As the sun drops behind the trees, the forge cools. The tools are oiled, the coals are spread, the tongs are hung. The blacksmith does not speak much. There is no one left to impress. The plow is fixed, the knife is sharpened, the bell is ready. Tomorrow will bring more. But tonight, he rests, not in a bed of silk, not under banners or gold, just straw, just quiet, just the deep, dull ache of honest work. This is not a life of glory. It is not a life of riches, but it is a life of meaning. Each scar was a lesson, each tool a child, each flame a prayer. He will die someday, like all men do, but his hammer will remain, and in some attic, some field, some workshop, it may still be found, still swing, still strike, still shape. That is the gift of the blacksmith. He builds what outlasts him. In today's world, we scroll, we tap, we consume, but the blacksmith, he builds, slowly, repeatedly, patiently. We call him old-fashioned, but maybe, just maybe, he understood something we've forgotten. That creation takes time. That fire must be respected. That tools should be worthy of being passed down. And that a life lived in service to something solid is a life that echoes long after the anvil goes quiet. There was no disaster, no war that burned the knowledge, no plague that silenced the masters, no divine punishment that scattered their secrets. No, we didn't lose the wisdom of iron. We walked away from it, piece by piece, strike by strike. We chose to forget, and in that forgetting, we lost more than steel. We lost time. Somewhere in Europe, not long after the Industrial Revolution began, a master blacksmith stood in his forge and watched a machine press shape a horseshoe in seconds. The tool that once took hours now emerged in minutes, clean, uniform, flawless. The master crossed his arms. He nodded, but inside, something dimmed, because he knew what would follow. Speed, scale, profit, and with it, the end of his rhythm, the silence of his hammer. In the name of progress, his forge would cool, and so would thousands more. It began slowly. First mass-produced nails, then saw blades, then chisels, hammers, hinges, knives. All cheaper, all faster, all perfect on paper. But under rain, under pressure, under time, they bent, they broke, they rusted. And the answer wasn't repair, it was replace. Why fix a 3-hammer when you can buy another? And so the cycle began, a loop of buying, breaking, tossing, buying again. Tools no longer had names, or stories, or soul. They had price tags. Once a man could leave his hammer to his son, not out of sentiment, out of function, because it still worked. The edge still held, the blade still rang, the steel still remembered the hand that shaped it. Now, we inherit nothing. We replace everything. The idea of a tool lasting 100 years feels like fantasy, but it wasn't. It was standard. It was expected, because permanence was built in. Now, we don't expect things to last. We expect them to fail. And that is a kind of forgetting. It wasn't just durability. We lost trust. When a tool was handmade, its maker stood behind it. If it failed, his name suffered. His guild judged him. His neighbors remembered. Today, no one knows who forged your wrench. No one cares. We lost ritual, the seasoning, the oiling, the careful storage, the daily maintenance, gone. Replaced with blister packs and quick manuals. We lost craft, the feel of slag in the palm, the slow unfolding of color on tempered steel, the judgment of readiness by glow, not gauge. And perhaps most of all, we lost meaning. A tool used to mean something, to hold weight, to whisper legacy. Now it means convenience, and nothing more. Imagine for a moment a world where the bloomery never vanished, where every city still had a forge, where every village blacksmith passed on his craft, where tools were made slowly, lovingly, properly. How different would our homes look? Would our bridges rust less? Would our fences still stand? Would we teach our children how to care for iron instead of how to shop for plastic? Would we feel connected to the objects we touch daily? Would we remember how to build things meant to stay? We now build skyscrapers with steel beams, ships the size of cities, trains that cross continents, but all of them rust. Every year, 2.5 trillion is lost globally to corrosion. We try to stop it with paints, coatings, treatments, but it's a war, and it's one we're losing because we forgot what the old smiths knew. That strength isn't just in mass, but in structure, in alloy, in imperfection. We made our steel too perfect, too sterile, and now it forgets itself faster than ever. But not all is lost. Some are returning to the forge, not to copy the past, but to learn from it. Modern metallurgists are reanalyzing ancient blades, reproducing bloomery iron, studying phosphorus oxide layers, testing slag stringer effects in lab simulations. They're finding that the old ways still work, and sometimes they work better. What if we blended ancient patience with modern knowledge? What if bridges were built with iron that wanted to last? What if knives could still be passed down for generations? What if we stopped designing for failure and started designing for forever? We live in a time of acceleration. Faster, cheaper, more, but speed has a price. And the rust on your gate? The crumbling bolt on your railing? The axe that dulls after one season? These are not flaws. They are reminders, whispers from the past, that we once knew how to make things well, that we once respected the earth's gifts and fire's power and the human hand, and that deep down we still can, if we choose. So now, pause. Look around. What do you own that could last 100 years? What do you touch daily that could outlive you? If the answer is nothing, then perhaps you've already felt the loss, but it is not too late. We can remember. We can slow down. We can rebuild the world the way a blacksmith builds a blade, one spark, one breath, one strike at a time. Thank you for listening. If this journey helped you see iron and history with new eyes, remember to subscribe so we can keep unearthing the lost stories of our past. And if you know someone who still believes in making things that last, share this with them, because together we can remember what we chose to forget and begin again.